Hello once again. After completing my last video on YouTube, I started to ponder what I had set to do with my early chess career in correspondence, and also given that I had touched pretty heavily on the hypermodern style in my last two videos, I thought I'd combine the two of them together and present this one to you. It is a game that I played some years ago. In fact, it was my first correspondence tournament after only recently having learnt the moves. So as you can see here, it is the NZCCA, the New Zealand Correspondence Chess Association. The game started in the autumn of 1973 in New Zealand, so it was about March, April time, and it finished about March, April in 1974. So it ran the full year. This wasn't the longest game that I played, but it was one of the longest. Just to show you what happened here, the tournaments are graded from the championship here right the way down in numerical order, in ascending order in fact, so that I'm right at the bottom. Now a lot of these players here, Ryan Louis, Mike Edwards, Richard Alexander, Douglas Green, they were much stronger in fact than the low place tournament would suggest, but it's like everything, you have to start at the bottom and work your way up. And so they had no idea, I think, of my playing strength. Really, I couldn't give them anything because I didn't have any over-the-board competition as such. So they really had no option but to put me in at the beginning. So as you can see, I scored a clean sweep with this one with 11 wins out of 11. And the games that particularly impressed both the NZCCA when deciding whether to publish any of my games and me, the game against Ryan Louis, which was a modern defence, e4, g6, against Mike Edwards, it was a Riti opening, so knight f3, d5, c4, and against Richard Alexander there it was an interesting Sicilian dragon. Now the dragon variation of the Sicilian is the fianchetto of the king's bishop. So it is a hypermodern defence, there's no doubt about that. And so what we'll do is we'll show this combination of correspondence game and hypermodern, which is here. I had one game published, as you can see, and it goes 43 moves. So we'll play this through and I'll give you my thoughts as we go through it. Okay, so the opening, as you would expect, is e4, c5, knight f3, d6, e4. It's all fairly standard stuff, so c takes d, knight takes d4. Black replies knight f6, knight c3, and then this of course illustrates how the dragon variation of the Sicilian is played. So effectively black on his fifth move plays g6 with the intention of fianchetting that bishop there to g7. So what is worth mentioning at this point is that I had no book or any lines at all on the dragon variation of the Sicilian. I knew the knight off fairly well, but I didn't have any details on this. And in correspondence, as any player who's familiar with correspondence will testify, you are allowed to use books to help you, but you're not allowed to gain the assistance of fellow humans. So if I'd had a book on the Sicilian dragon, then I would have looked at it. I only acquired one after the conclusion of this game because it aroused my interest, and it was in fact the Sicilian dragon by the Scottish international master David Levy, published by Batsford around the mid-1970s. So after black has played g6, I played here bishop e2. There are other choices, but like I say, I just didn't know the theory, and I played what I consider to be a suitable developing move, bishop e2. Black continues with the plan to fianchetto. So bishop g7. And I castled. And black similarly castled. So that's the position at black's 7th move. At this stage, I decided to bring my knight around here, and black continued his development as you would expect. Knight c6. And then I pushed this pawn on. You could probably have played bishop e3 there, but I decided to play f4. Of course, if black plays his queen to b6, giving check, you just need to move the king to h1. The beauty of playing bishop e2, of course, is that the knight cannot then come to g4 because you just whip it off. So the reply to f4 is 9e6. And what I played here is bishop to f3, because clearly black was planning d5, and so that scuppers him, because if he were now to play d5, you'd win a pawn by e takes d, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5. So in answer to bishop f3, my opponent played knight to e7, renewing the idea of playing d5. This is pretty customary in the Sicilian, as most players will realise. To break it with d5 in the centre is the way, if black can manage to do it. So then I did play bishop to e3. I mentioned that just a moment ago. White plays it, which now rules out queen b6. And black plays d5. And I played here an interesting move, bishop to c5, pinning the knight on e7 against the rook. And so black unpins by rook to e8, like so. And what I did, I was pretty adventurous here. I wasn't bothered too much about the centre. I thought, well, that's pretty much under control. My bishops are looking quite useful. The knight's also good, and the knight on b3 can easily come back into play at any time. So I decided to push this pawn, g4. And I think that is pretty sound. I've looked at this position again after all these years, and I can't really see anything wrong with this move. So that's g4. And that was on white's 13th move. Now, black replied with b6, wanting to get rid of the bishop. So what do we do here? Do we take the knight on e7? I don't really see there's much point in doing that then or now. So what I in fact played was bishop d4. That is the move that I would have played if it were right this minute, bishop d4, hitting the knight on f6. The only thing that's protecting that knight, of course, is the bishop on g7. So black continues with his development. He's fianchettoed on the other side. So this is a double fianchetto in the Dragon Sicilian. And he's overprotecting d5, of course, in so doing. So d5 is fine for black, it would seem at the moment. So white has just played 14 bishop d4, bishop b7. What would you play here? You pause the video if you want. I'll just give you a few seconds and then I'll tell you what I played. I suppose there are some interesting ideas possibly with the idea of playing g5 and maybe maybe e5. I'm not sure that either of those is quite right. I'm not sure about f5. There are possibilities. I've not really looked into those, but you could always play around with them. What I in fact played was I'm giving up the bishop. So bishop takes f6. And of course, black has to take back with his bishop. Many would say the two bishops are worth keeping on the board. And that is generally correct. Although I think here that is the correct move, as will be seen in a few more moves. So black has just played 15, bishop takes f6. I then played here. That was the idea of taking on f6 so that I could march that. And then black is left with no option really but to put that bishop back. Because if he were to come to here, he's in danger of getting it trapped, possibly by playing here. And he wouldn't want that. So he does, of course, quite wisely just retreat back from whence it came. Bishop g7. That's on the 16th move. I'd already envisaged that I wanted to get my queen on to the king side. It's okay on the d-line, but I thought it better to get the queen onto the king side and perhaps occupy the d-line with the rook. So I played queen e1. The idea of bringing the queen to g3 at some point. And so black returns to c6 with his knight. In case you're wondering what would happen if instead of knight c6 black had played d4, well, of course, the problem with that is that he'd lose his bishop and then you're attacking the rook, so the attack on the knight would be irrelevant. So he wouldn't want that. So he wants to play d4, but he doesn't want to play it just at that stage. So knight c6 is probably the correct move in that position. And I followed through with queen g3. There we are. Let's take a look at that for a moment. That's after 18, queen g3. The idea, of course, is to pawn storm on the king's side and possibly back the queen up with the rooks. So black played here, bishop a6. First of all, he's getting this bishop off the diagonal so that eventually he can try and push the pawn, which of course he can't do at the moment because now the knight is en prise. But the idea being to play rook c8 at some point, presumably. What he's doing at the moment, of course, he's hitting my rook on f1. So what do we do about that? Well, I played rook f2 with the idea eventually, like I say, of lining up down the g line or the h line. So how does black reply to 19 rook f2? Well, he played rook c8, as I suggested he might. So he's covering the knight and he's preparing d4. So let's have a pawn storm here, h4, which I think looks pretty impressive. Those pawns look quite good. I was very keen on Paul Morphy at the stage and always have been and always will be, and this is the sort of attack I think that Paul Morphy would like. At least I'd like to think so, because it was reckoned that he conducted his attack to one side of the board more often than not rather than in the center, and this is exactly what I'm doing here. I did have the P.W. Sargent's book, Morphy's Games of Chess, at this stage, and it was very helpful to me in my correspondence play. So that's h4, 20, h4. Black plays d4. So this is it. So how do we deal with this? Is he going to kick that knight away? Where does it go? Or can we play something else? Knight e4 is a possibility there. I suppose you could, with the idea possibly of playing knight f6 at some point, or knight d6 at some point. If you were to play here, the likeliest reply would probably be to take the bishop to f8 to stop here, Although, of course, the problem then is that you'd go to f6 and you'd fork the king and the rook. So what is really the reply there after knight e4? You are threatening knight d6, forking the two rooks, there's no doubt about that. He'd probably have to play something like rook maybe to e7 or rook c7, so that there's no danger when the knight goes into d6 forking the two rooks. That looks quite good now that I look at it with hindsight. I can't remember whether I considered this move or not, but that does have possibilities, I suppose you would have to say. I can't see that there's anything wrong with playing knight e4 there, and it does present black with a bit of a problem. So that is a move that's probably worth looking at for anyone who wants to further investigate this position. But I didn't play knight e4. I played instead the natural move, and this again is a typical Morphy move, pinning the pawn against the queen. So of course, if black were to try and take the knight, you just whip the queen off. So how does black respond to that? Well, he plays this. Which is evidently a grave error of judgment. It doesn't look that bad, but as will be seen, it loses a pawn. What is he trying to do there? I suppose he's trying to play at some point b4 and shift the knight that way. But what white in fact does is he plays bishop takes c6. Now he probably didn't think that I'd play this, because in so doing, white has given up both of these bishops, and so now has two knights against two bishops, which would seem to suggest that black may well have an advantage so long as his bishops are in play. But if you look at the king's bishop, it's completely out of play. If you look at the queen's bishop, it's also out of play. So I don't really think that you can look on that as a problem. So after 22 bishop takes c6, he plays rook takes c6. Let's just take a look at that. And now, of course, the problem is the knight is no longer there to defend the pawn on d4. If I said d5 before, I apologize for that. I'm having to translate from descriptive notation into algebraic. So it's the pawn on d4 that is now attacked. So white has a choice. Does he take with the rook or does he take with the knight? He could take with the rook, I suppose. But I decided to play knight takes d4. And hit the rook on c6. So he replied with rook c4, hitting the knight. So how does white reply to that? Well, he doesn't have a problem there at all, really, because what he does, in fact, is he plays knight takes e6. I'll just put this back for a moment. I'm just wondering what would have happened if, in fact, he'd played here, covering this pawn here, and then, well, in fact, it's the same result, isn't it? Because if he takes the knight, then you'd still whip the queen off, and the rook is covered by the knight here. So it doesn't really matter where that rook goes. It, in fact, went here. White does reply with knight takes e6. And what he's doing there is he's attacking black's queen twice, but it's a discovered attack. So should he take the knight with either the rook or the pawn, the queen comes off. So that is a definite loss of a pawn. Again, so white is now 2 pawns up, although, like I said earlier, he only has 2 knights against 2 bishops, but black's bishops are not really going to be able to do that much until a bit later in the game. So black plays queen c8. He's hitting the knight, and he's doubling his attack on c3. So the bishop comes off, so black gets one of his bishops, white rather gets one of his bishops back, and king takes g7. And then I played here a3. The idea being, of course, to stop b4. As can be seen in this position, white has all the space. He has the king side pretty well worked out. He's controlling the d line. He's controlling d5. He's also threatening to double rooks, perhaps on the d line, or double rooks on the f line. Perhaps at some point play king h2 and rook f1 or g1. So it's looking pretty good, and he's 2 pawns up. So I think this is already a winning game, and that's what I thought at the time. But let me just get this right. Yeah, queen c5. That's what black plays there. And what he's doing here, of course, he's pinning the rook on the f line. So that can be a bit annoying if you want to move that rook, and you certainly will want to move it. So white moves the king to h2, like I indicated just a moment ago. That is the idea anyway. So black has just really precipitated white playing king h2 by forcing his hand. So then black plays b4 nonetheless. You take the pawn. And then the queen takes the pawn, threatening b2. Now black's light squared bishop is coming into the game somewhat. So I decided to play it safe and play here, covering the b pawn. Of course, at this stage, should black play here, hoping for taking here, and then the queen would win the rook. Of course, after rook takes c3, queen takes c3, so there's no win of a piece there. In fact, black loses the exchange, and with it the game. So what black does is he doubles rooks on the c line. Talking about white doubling rooks, well, black's doubled them. So what happens now? Well, you play here. Hitting the queen. So there's clearly no time for taking on c2 because the queen would go. So the queen has to move. Where does it go? Well, he in fact moved to b7. White decides to play knight to king 3, or knight e3, hitting the rook on c4. So the rook has to move. So it decides to go to b4, renewing the attack on b2. Black has to be careful because there are one or two knight forks floating around and he doesn't want to be caught up in those. So how does white continue this position? Just take a look at that for a moment. Black has just played 31 rook to b4. How does white continue? He has 2 pawns up. There is a winning move here. This is a problem in itself. When you look at it, white to move. How does he force the issue, really? Okay, well, it's knight f5 check. Now, the point of this move is that the king, should it move anywhere, is leaving black exposed to the possibility of that fork. And that is something that black wouldn't want, because that would definitely end the game immediately. So that wouldn't be of any use to him at all. So he has no option but to take the knight. And what we'll do here is we'll leave this and I'll come back to it in a short video with the conclusion. Thanks for watching and goodbye for now.